Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan guru-murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. My guest this week is the comedian Paul Chowdhry, who I first discovered, maybe 10 years ago, when he did a very funny show called What's Happening White People. And he's done shows since that you may have seen on various streaming platforms, and he's out on tour at the moment with a new show called Paul Chowdhry, Family Friendly Comedian. But you're not at all family friendly in truth, are you, Paul?
Well, I want to be as family friendly as Ant and Dec and yourself, really. I think that's the aim, is to become mainstream. I want to be one of the, hey guys, hey, the, hey, how are you? Make people feel very welcoming and friendly, like yourself when you interviewed Quentin Tarantino or the Iron Man.
Yes, they went well. You'll notice my interviewing style has changed a little since then.
Because when we grew up to comedy in the mainstream in the early 80s, when our families would sit down, it was Bruce Forsyth, Morecambe and Wise. It was all those kinds of Saturday night showmen. And entertainment has changed considerably since then, hasn't it? It's very different, and it's a very different market now. And I suppose Ant and Dec were supposed to be the antithesis and the reincarnation of Morecambe and Wise, but it didn't really work out that way, did it?
I mean, in the trailer, you do say, you don't want to be cancelled. I mean, do you fear being cancelled?
Well, they say every comic is one joke with being cancelled. I think I was kind of cancelled before I even started. I'm not really a mainstream act who's on every TV show. I'm kind of known to be a stand-up. I'm not the guy that's a celebrity guy and he's appearing on celebrity shows here and there. So in a way, when the show you mentioned, What's Happening White People, was released in 2012, it was considered quite a controversial title. And there weren't many people, like now there's the book, Why I Can No Longer Talk to White People About Race, and that's quite a recent book. But back in 2012, it was kind of, how come you can say what's happening white people, mate? We can't say what's happening, expletive. I came up through a slightly different time when I started mid-98, early 2000s, when there wasn't much diversity quotas within the media sectors as such. Obviously, you came through, Krishnan, an early time, so that debunks that slight argument. But in terms of comedy, there was a serious lack of diversity. But then you'd go to the extremes because you'd see people like Bernard Manning on TV, the use of derogatory racial slurs within his shows as a punchline. But that was what comedy was in England. You turn on Mind Your Language or certain shows, you look back on them now and we weren't portrayed as kind of that cool, or even we were just immigrants in the country. And
how did you feel about Bernard Manning? I mean, I always just, hated it and didn't find it funny. I mean, so I couldn't really see what was funny in it because of the racism. Did you get past that?
I did get past the racism. I remember watching a Bernard Manning video and there were Asian people in the audience and he immediately just called them, there's a in the audience, and there was a joke about it, but that was what was used as a punchline, and the whole audience were erupting into laughter, and they'd kind of smile. The Asian guys in the audience would smile, but what else are they going to do? They're not going to then heckle in a room full of racists, and ultimately the comic being a racist. And I thought, this isn't a place for me. This isn't. So I wanted to be, if I ever got into the profession or if you tried stand-up, because you don't know you can become a stand-up until you do stand-up, because you don't know how the audience is going to react to you. They could hate you, and it never works again. I think he's still a very skilled performer. Bernard Manning was a very skilled... At that time, he was from the mainstream circuit who would share each other's jokes. But he clearly had a great delivery performance, a command of the stage. And there were lots of things going for Bernard Manning, which is why he was one of the biggest comics in England at the time. Whether his political views you don't agree with, it's irrelevant to his performance and as an artist on stage.
I saw one of your lines as, you were Asian before it was fashionable, and I was thinking, I was Asian before it was fashionable. I'm still not sure it's fashionable. But your comedy has kind of migrated quite a lot, hasn't it? That first show that I saw, it felt quite self-deprecating, or self-deprecating of the community from which you came.
Yeah, so my community, other communities, I think, ultimately I see us all as kind of being one community with different sectors of differences within other communities and other races, but ultimately we're the same. We're all pretty much the same when it comes to it, and that's the kind of the joke in it. And it's not where some people say, "Oh, how can we say that?" Because that's what I've lived through. Growing up in the late 70s and early 80s in England and living as an British Asian man in England, it was a different time, and to kind of get through it was humour pulled me through. You're a couple of years older than me, so you would have experienced that as well. And at the time, it was comedy wasn't. We didn't see anyone that looked like us doing comedy. In fact, I'd turn on the TV and see acts like Bernard Manning using the P word or the N word as a punchline, or sitcoms on mainstream TV and primetime BBC shows, and the P word was used as a punchline. And I was thinking, this comedy isn't really for us. It's not for people from my background or who look like me. So I wanted to kind of counteract that if I ever got into that profession.
But I mean, I was interested that you used the P word, or that you talk about the P word, because I've been talking about this quite a lot recently at work, because I've only just noticed us calling it the P word. This is all to do with the cricket racism scandal, obviously, and I feel very ambivalent about it. I mean, I'm very much still in that zone of, does it sanitize the word? Does it take away the power of what I experienced when I was called that, if we don't say what it is?
Okay, well, in terms of where they were used, in terms of the racists using it as, and then the argument on the news was like, how come we can't say that, mate? People call me a Brit all the time. It's short for British. But no one ever went British bashing. It wasn't used in the same way. It was used as a weapon almost when I was growing up. And I do use the word within my shows, but it has to have a context. And I think using it on a podcast or a news show or a topical debate is very different to be using it to prove a point.
I mean, your comedy's like that anyway, isn't it? Sort of in that there are all sorts of topics that you wouldn't normally joke about, that you do manage to joke about. I mean, every possible taboo in the world, but you do it in context.
I think people would joke about them. Whether they would joke about them within the mainstream of comedy, that's the question. Chris Rock, Chappelle, Eddie Murphy, countless comics over the years have probably joked about similar subjects and issues within their communities, but it has never been done, I think, really from an Asian perspective. And that's probably where I got the stick for it. How come you can say that, mate, and we can't? Because we've kind of lived through it, and first, second generation immigrants to the country. When you came, you're a couple of years older than me, and we're talking about the lack of diversity and opportunity. Talking about acting, for example, you went up for a film called Madame Sazatska, I remember.
That's right, yeah.
Which actually my first cousin got the role in, Naveen Chowdhry.
Oh, really? He's your cousin?
He's my first cousin, yeah.
Wow. I never knew that. That's really funny.
And at that time, I remember the casting call. Every Asian in the country, well, not me, I was a bit younger than that at the time, but your age group, every Asian actor in the country was up for that one role. Yeah. There was one role available.
Yeah.
And now you look at comedy and even acting, and it's changed slightly because there are more opportunities, but still, we look at each other as competition sometimes. Then how come he's got the part and I haven't, or they've got that TV show and I haven't? And it's not because we're competing against each other, it's because there's that lack of opportunity. And I was talking to Naveen about this as well, and there must have been a time when you thought, well, acting isn't for me because there's only one or two roles out there, and then you became a newsreader. And it's interesting how you've taken that diversion as well.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, the funny thing was I ended up interviewing Naveen when I got my first, on one of my first breaks on TV. I ended up interviewing him about the film. And yeah, I think I probably did think in those days, well, there's not space for two of us in Britain. I mean, as it is, everybody thinks there's only one Asian newsreader, you know, and he does the 6 o'clock news and News 24 and me, you know, or, you know. So I mean, you know, the idea of being more than one Asian actor was pretty impossible.
And it was the royal film of 1989. The Queen Mother came to see it, and all my family went to see it at the time. There haven't been many leading Indian actors in films then until, I suppose, Slumdog Millionaire.
Yeah.
In a main, and there's a massive gap there in terms of what happened. And I think the Asian community are slightly less vocal when it comes to the oppression that's received within the media circles, rather than, I think the black community are much more vocal, and that's why there's a discussion of why is there no black Bond. There's never been a discussion of why there's no Indian Bond. The black community are very vocal in the oppression they've received. I think it's incredible, and the strides and where they are now within the entertainment sector. Obviously, there's lots of work still to do, but the Asian community don't have that voice within the media, and they're almost submissive. It's like, okay, we'll take what we're given almost sometimes, and well, let's not complain. Let's just get on with it. And I've been a slightly more vocal member of that community that's within the media, and slightly more hard hitting. And I did come up through the black circuit as a comic, and performing in black clubs in America and even in England. And that's probably why my comedy tends to go for the jugular more. Because when you do a black show, people want to laugh. When you go to the Edinburgh Fringe, it's really interesting. It's lovely. Okay, when you go to a black show, people throw the seats across the room because they're laughing so much and they run around. And that's why if you've ever been to a black show, you know, people they'll smack the table or smack the chairs, and you know when you've ripped it hard. And that's when I came up through that circuit, and that's why I wanted to be that kind of comic, that hard-hitting punchlines, machine gun type of comic.
But what sort of gave you the confidence then to start joking the way you do? I mean, I remember seeing, you know, What's Happening White People and kind of being blown away by it and thinking, wow, this is amazing. This is a guy who's kind of prepared to joke about the stuff that's, A, we might joke about privately but daren't say, you know, but B is kind of like really kind of, well, laughing about, you know, his own Asian culture or Indian culture, but is also, you know, relentlessly taking the piss out of white people, and the sort of all the awkwardnesses and ambiguities around that. So, but that was a really big step. Where did it come from?
I never went to drama school. I never went to Oxford or Cambridge. I didn't know the things you couldn't say in public or within the media. So the kind of stuff I joked about when I went on stage was the stuff that I'd lived through and I spoke to my friends about from any racial background. So those are the kinds of things. It was very kind of street comedy because that's where I kind of grew up. It was a very working class background, and I never went to a private school. I never had a degree in medicine like yourself. You know,
not a degree, but a place at medical school.
Oh right.
I had to switch to politics. But
that's good enough though for me, mate.
Can we talk about where you came from? You know, childhood and what it was like. Your dad worked on the buses, is that right?
Yeah, my dad came to this country in 1964 from India, from the Punjab as a Sikh, turban-wearing Sikh. Moved to London, Willesden Green, and the money he made in the factories and certain jobs at that time, there were only factory jobs available for Asians who were coming over at the time, even if they were doctors or lawyers, and those were the peak of opportunities back in the mid and late 60s, even early 70s. But that was seen as people would work 3 or 4 jobs just to, and at that time he was then paying for flights for other family members to come to England and ultimately migrate to the UK. And then I was born in the mid 70s in Edgware, in North, the rough streets, gangster-ridden Edgware.
How do you look back on your early childhood and the way you lived?
I went to a state school, and it was a pretty rough school at the time. I think it was the lowest performing school in the area, which I'm very proud of. At that time, going to school in the early 80s, you weren't only dealing with who you were as an individual, because your family literally came over not long before you went to school, and your family had an accent, and then you're dealing with racists and coming. I remember just going home from school and am I going to bump into a racist that's going to start calling me a and stuff, or am I going to get into a situation where I've got to get out of a fight or pretty much run? You know, we were good runners, but not professionally.
I mean, how much racism did you encounter as a kid? I would have assumed, because I grew up in the Northwest, that because London was this sort of multicultural city, big melting pot with lots of immigrant communities, that it wasn't as bad.
It wasn't as bad, I think, as certain other areas from what I was told at that time. But there was, and, you know, I grew up, he would be exactly the same age as me, Stephen Lawrence, for example. Now, that was in London, and he was exactly the same age as me when it happened. So those were, in parts of London, there were seriously racist areas. So you just take a wrong turn, and London's a very small city anyway. So you could be in one area, and I remember I never wanted to go to Feltham because of that, because it just stayed inhenged in my mind that this is just a proper racist area, and there were parts where you'd go through. BNP setting up in bookshops at the time, and we'd lost people, and my dad was attacked.
What happened in that? Because I mean, it sounds horrific.
Well, it was in Stanmore. Yeah, it was in Stanmore at my uncle's birthday, and they came back. Him and his brothers and a bunch of friends. A group of lads shouted out, and my uncle told them to basically, and they came with knives and and my dad jumped in the way of one of the knife guys who was going to stab his brother, and then took a knife to the face, so he took quite a serious, he's still got the scars on his face now, at 90 years old, he's got the scars on his face. And I remember the next day, going home and family members being there. My dad was in hospital, and I was in tears, and I was very concerned about the whole thing. And my dad just comes home with stitches on his face like nothing had happened. He was used to it. It was like living through the 60s and 70s in England, and that was in the 80s. It was just another thing. It was like we get on with it.
How do you feel about that now? Because I mean, when I think back to all the incidents that happened to me as a kid, the one that really sticks in my head is walking through Burnley town centre and my dad being spat on from a balcony. And my dad was a doctor who probably helped one way or another half the population of that town over decades. And it's still the incident that sort of burns a fury in me, now, much more than anything that happened to me. I wonder how you feel about what happened to your dad.
It bothered me a lot at the time, but it didn't surprise me. It was like another incident. Whereas my dad had a shop in Southall for 15 years, a snack bar, which I used to make sandwiches in. And a woman would work at our shop, and her husband was a minicab driver in Southall. I remember this growing up as well, where he was on his last job, and he said, I'll do the last job because he's on the way home anyway. But the guy that was going to get into the taxi said, the next guy I see, I'm going to kill him. Which he did. He stabbed him in the head about 50 times from the back of the taxi. And she was left as a single mother with children to deal with her. And that was just, and I remember waking up, and then the guy, he must be out of prison by now. So this would have been around 25 years ago, so he'd be out by now. And these are the kinds of people that live amongst us who then say, how come you can't say the P word, but you can say Brit? How come you can say, it's just short for British, mate? They're still living amongst us. They're still a part of the community, but they just can't say it openly now, which does, can have counter effects and can cause more issues.
Because one of the things you revealed in your last show on the Amazon show was that you'd also lost your mother very young.
Yeah, I was 5 years old. That was a tough time, and about around 1979, 80. So, I talked about that.
Do you remember your mother very well?
Yeah, I still have quite strong memories from back then. Um, she worked within the factories as well when she came to England. Yeah, I have a lot of very strong images of growing up from the age of vivid memories from around 1 till about 6. So I remember that time quite vividly. But people say you can't remember those points in your life. But yeah, when you have massive incidences in your life, I think they stay with you. So then it does make you want to stay very childlike as you get older, which is probably why I haven't matured as well as I should have. I don't know, it can have, I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know the implications it could have had upon me, but I stayed quite childlike and quite shy for a long time. But when you're an adult and you're shy, you're just seen as arrogant. You're not really seen as a shy individual. When you're a child, it's shyness. So when you're an adult, you're just an arrogant idiot who's not talking to people. So I've managed to find comedy as a conduit to release the inner demons in me to a certain degree.
So are you doing more politics in your show now?
I think it's hard not to do politics about what we've just lived through for the past 2 years. It's like if we just came out of World War II and I just carried on talking about my shopping trolley and the till self-service checkout. Like, you could have done this show 2 years ago. It wouldn't have been any different. It's like living through 9/11. You had to address it, or the London 7/7, for instance. I had to address it. I had to rewrite my show. That's comedy. It's a reflection of life itself, and as I said earlier on, what I've lived through. So politics does tend to have an influence to the material.
You mentioned terror, and obviously that has framed to a large degree your career.
Well, no, they don't. They've never. I'll be honest with you. I want to say this publicly, Krishnan. I have no association with them. I think you're thinking of Anjem Chowdhry.
You've hit that topic very head on. And was it just because, again, that's your life, or because it's kind of the thing that people don't talk about, so let's talk about it?
Well, yeah, I talk about it. I spoke about it in a previous tour in 2007 when I did the Underbelly Caves in Edinburgh. I was performing in the caves, and at that time, Bin Laden was hiding in a cave. And also I was approached by, at that time, I think it was Crime Watch, to do a reconstruction of the 7/7 bombings.
As an actor?
As one of the Luton bombers. They asked me to play one of the Luton bombers. Well, I wouldn't say actor, yeah, I suppose he is an actor. And my routine was about how people think EastEnders characters are real, so they get abuse in the street. You can imagine what I'd have to live through. He's a terrorist, mate. No, that he died in the actual... No, I don't care, mate. You look like him. Let's do him. You know, it would have been a massive issue for me. So I said no to that at the time. And so I think it was about £250 to potentially play a terrorist for the London bombings. And then I was performing in a cave as well. So that was a reflection. And then in the last tour, Live In It, there was a terrorist who tried to bomb an RAF site. And I started getting tweets because apparently the guy looked exactly like me. Well, the photo fit looked like me. I don't know if the guy looked like me. So that became a news story. And then look where we are now. The Taliban have taken over Afghanistan. So I think it's one of the world stories that does tend to resurface. I'd rather not talk about it, but it's still there and it's going on.
What is your take on where you sit in all of this? I mean, do you genuinely think you risk being cancelled?
Cancelled from what, really? The only thing you can really be cancelled from is not getting booked at theatres, and then you can, open up a civic centre and sell tickets. So what would I be cancelled from, really? I'm not really a part of a channel. I'm not a reoccurring role in anything. Well, in Devils, which I've just wrapped on with Patrick Dempsey, a drama, for example, which I act in, and bits in. I was in Cruella with Emma Stone, which is a tenuous link there to a plug on a film. But what could I get cancelled from, really? That's the question. After my last deal with Amazon get taken off Amazon, and what's happening to white people is barely available anymore. So has that been cancelled? That's the question. Has that now been cancelled? Without it silently cancelled is another thing. I think publicly cancelled is different to silently cancelled. Some people you don't ever hear from again, and are they cancelled?
And do you think you should be able to joke about all of these things?
I think you should be able to joke about anything.
Is the defence, it's a joke, the defence for anything?
Well, when it borders on hate speech, then no, because it's pretty obvious when someone's doing a joke. When you're on stage and you're holding a microphone and your show is sold as a stand-up show and a comedy show, and then people are going away offended by one. Like when people watched Live Innit and were offended by some of the routines, as standalone routines, but you weren't offended by the other parts. People are only offended by things when it affects them. And that's the problem we have here. So who's the governor when it comes to what we're going to be offended by? So you could have watched Live Innit and loved it and then been offended by one routine and thought, okay, I'm going to cancel him for that one routine. But then you laughed at the other stuff about the other people. So I should say this, but I joke about anti-Semitism within the show. And so have someone from my background and looking like me joking and trying to break down and ridicule anti-Semitism isn't in the norm. So I joke about discrimination within all groups, and ultimately by the end of the shows people come out and thinking we're all pretty much the same. We're all laughing at each other's idiocies. Humans are idiots a lot of the time, and that's what we find funny amongst ourselves. But then people can consider you anti-Semitic or consider you xenophobic or homophobic. But then when you're tackling those issues, you have to be ready for sometimes people saying, well, I was offended for that. I had, from my last tour and a couple of tours ago, a big broadsheet reviewer came to see me, and he pointed out I'm sat amongst a predominantly Asian audience. Now, it's interesting when reviewers point that out, because when you go and see Jackie Mason or Chris Rock, you wouldn't say I'm sat amongst a predominantly black audience here. But it seems to be we're fair game. Asian audience is a fair game to say that about.
But if people are offended by something you said, how do you feel about that? Are you sorry about it, or did you just say, well, that's just the way things are? You're going to offend some people.
Well, I think any outlet within the media which is spoken word, you're going to offend. The Rolling Stones offended. Elvis offended with his gyration of his hips at the time, and that was music. I could find the Beatles incredible, or the Rolling Stones, who were the two of the biggest bands at the time, but the people aren't going to like them. And I know people aren't going to like me, and I know there's going to be an audience that do like me and that have managed to sustain my career for this long. I'm grateful for that audience, and they tend to resonate to who I am, and maybe they can relate to who they are within the context of the comedy performance, and it makes them comfortable with what they've also lived through because they've had a similar.
And do you see a new generation coming up, or is it still basically you and Nish Kumar?
There's a lot more diversity within comedy, gender inclusion, which wasn't around in the early. I kind of wish there were Nish Kumars and Romesh's back in the early 2000s, because we would have made many more strides. It wasn't just me, and at that time, I'd say a Shafi Khorsandi or an Omid Jalili, who were both Iranian, but we were all considered the same. Iran and India are two very different, and their upbringing in England was very different to ours, for example. Hopefully I've made a slight contribution to that. I remember going to see an agent back in the early 2000s who represents one of the biggest entertainers in England. I won't mention the name or the agent, but she said, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to do stand-up and a bit of acting, maybe presenting here and there. And she just had a massive go. Her assistant was a real fan, so that's how I got the meeting. She said, you do too much. You can't do everything. You need to focus on something. What acting, presenting, and stand-up. And now everyone does everything within the media. You'll see yourself on comedy shows and doing a podcast and doing the news, and potentially I might see you as the next Bond, Krishnan guru-murthy. And it wouldn't be far-fetched if it happened. But back then, they didn't see there was an audience for an Asian comic, even though I'm British. So I don't just perform to an Asian audience. In fact, I came up for over 10 years to performing to white audiences, which is where I learned my craft in the comedy clubs, which were pretty racist then. And I would have the P word thrown at me on stage, even said backstage amongst promoters and other comics, in a form of what they called irony at the time.
Why Paul? Why are you not Taj Paul? And were you always Paul?
Well, when I remember that my dad taking me to school at 4 years old, and they said, "What's his name?" And my dad says, "Taj Paul." And I said, "Do you mind if we call you Paul?" And it stuck. And then she introduced me as Paul Chowdhry to the class, not Taj Paul Singh Chowdhry, which is my full name. And I did joke about it in one of my previous shows, and the reason that I call myself Paul Chowdhry for comedic value was, "What's your name, mate?" "It's Taj Paul." "Tadpole? Can't call you that, mate. It's call you Paul, mate." You know, it was easy for them to pronounce.
And so if you could change the world in any way, what would you do?
At the moment, I'd probably make the vaccine rollout equal around the world. Get rid of vaccine hoarding.
That's really interesting that you choose that one, because no one's ever said that before.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of our end thoughts are very overlapping. They're about climate change and all those sorts of things. And no one's ever actually pointed that one out. And, well, it's been an absolute pleasure. I have to say, I'm really surprised that we've had this conversation. It's not the one I was expecting at all. Because listening to your podcast and I'm trying to just research you, just looking for interviews with you. Most of your interviews are, well, they're funny, and they're you in, well, not you're not in character, are you? But I mean, I didn't think you were going to take it seriously.
Well, I tried to not take it seriously, but at 12 o'clock in the afternoon for a comic is when he's quite serious and half asleep. So hopefully some of this has made sense, because people were watching going, "Oh, this guy's really serious, mate. Oh, see." It's a bit early for me, mate. You know what I mean? See me at 9 o'clock at night, I'm hilarious.
Paul Chowdhry, thank you very much indeed for joining us. I hope you enjoyed that. You can watch all of these interviews on the Channel 4 News YouTube channel. Our producer is Fola Olorunselu. Until next time, bye-bye.